A lot of the teams I spend time with have issues with mid-game communication, and it pretty much always stems from this really unhelpful attitude towards comms and how they should work. A lot of players will have seen some guide or heard some terms, and then have this idea about how they need a shot caller, a backup caller, 3 different types of target caller, and so on. And they'll try to enforce this really rigid comm structure that almost never works and just ends up with loads of confusion and everyone yelling over each other. This isn't to say that having those rough calling roles is always wrong, but more that they need to be allowed to grow organically. A lot of teams will overstretch themselves by trying to force this type of structure way too early, when they're missing lots of far more important fundamentals, and their players haven't been given a chance to comfortably settle in with regards to comms. When teams do use structures like these successfully, they're a lot more dynamic than people think, and more importantly, they're built from the ground up around the players, rather than immediately shoehorning them into calling roles. A lot of people do really like their cast iron calling structures, so maybe this seems a little controversial, but I promise you I'm speaking from experience. A lot of the time, pushing structures like these will really hurt teams, and distract them from the core gameplay issues they should be focusing on instead. The first step in creating healthier comms is getting everyone to just chill out. So many teams will try to force comms to keep everyone talking constantly in an attempt at synergy, but that just ends up with 4 people narrating the fight and no one really knowing what's going on. I even see teams think they need someone to be yelling to try and hype up the team. You don't. Slow it down. Comms in a lot of teams are just way too intense to be useful. Because cooling down comms is an important part of creating a healthier overall environment too. When teams are talking so much, it makes it really difficult for their players to listen and actually figure out the info inside the comms. These teams too are often the ones that get stuck up on previous fights and spend valuable time mid-game going over or even arguing about stuff in the past. This all adds up and it makes it impossible for their players to concentrate, meaning they don't have enough time to mentally reset in between fights. And all of this just creates this environment where over the course of a map or scrim, things just keep getting more and more intense until those teams break down. Obviously, this isn't to say be silent in your games, just that most teams call far too much, in a way that goes beyond the simple info players need, and into this dynamic where players are trying to sort of excessively micro each other, which just piles up that confusion and intensity, and doesn't let players build confidence in each other. Because, and I guess this is the other point of the video, the work that goes into good comms doesn't actually happen during the game. If we look at what comms really are, all you're doing is alerting your teammates to a situation they don't have good info on, but a situation they've probably seen hundreds of times before and should have a good understanding of. Usually the only comm needed is that really simple info just to let them know which of those situations that is. After that, everything they do is almost independent. You've given them the info, they already have the understanding, now they're making their own decision on how to react. Let's say the enemy team is setting up to dive your Ana. The only opening comm you need here is something really simple like Winston staging left side, that immediately alerts your team to what the enemy are going for. It doesn't overwhelm anything, and it allows your team to quickly recognize the situation and use their own understanding of it to react accordingly. Because you've said the word staging, your team immediately understands that the enemy is setting up for a dive, and instead of clogging comms with 6 people yapping about what's going on, everyone can just be allowed to play their roles according to the situation you've alerted them to. Your D.Va could respond by contesting the Winston in his staging area, your Lucio can get ready to peel for Ana, and depending on specifics, your Tracer might get ready to go for a backline trade. But none of that response needs to clog up the comms, because all you're doing is letting players do their own jobs. And this slots into the wider idea of defaults and shot calling, as your teammates should understand what staging means for them, and how they individually can respond to it. All your calls are actually doing is making sure your team is on the same page with regards to defaults. Simple calls like play for counter dive or trade backlines is all you really need in terms of base comms, providing your team is already set up for those defaults. I'll talk a lot more in other videos about shot calling and especially defaults because it's really up there in terms of important team skills, but this really is what I mean by the real work towards good comms being done outside of the game. Because a lot of the time, teams overcomming is caused by them not understanding those situations to begin with. Maybe players don't fully understand staging, maybe players have issues with spacing that are screwing up the defaults. Maybe players just don't understand their actual role in a comp. There are a lot of gameplay issues teams have that mess up their fights, and most teams will try to compensate for this by overcomming. But this really doesn't help, and those extra comms often cause more problems, as well as making it much more difficult to identify the core issues in the first place. So to build healthier comms, first really slow it down. Understand that outside of giving info, or those core things like rotations, targets, or timings of engages or combos, you really don't need to comm as much as people think. Just keep it chill. So much of the work that goes into good synergy is done by players learning their roles and learning how their role changes depending on each situation. Overcomming to try and fix this mid-game just makes the problem so much worse. Make sure things don't get so intense that your players get uncomfortable, and definitely don't try to force a rigid comm structure too early. Players will naturally slot into a rough structure if you give them time, and it's much better to work up into a structure by encouraging players to fill those calling roles rather than immediately forcing one down on them. Let them just call info and timing specific to them, so you can start building that confidence in each other without stepping over each other in the comms. Also, it goes without saying, but the other part of this is keeping negativity out of comms by always looking forward. I'll talk about this more in a video about resets, but make sure that your comms don't get too stuck up on fights or mistakes in the past. Conversations like this are more or less always negative, and often only between 2 or 3 players. They'll clog up the comms and just tilt or confuse the rest of the team. Keep everything you can until after the game, where players actually have time to think in depth about mistakes. So when it comes to comms as a whole, less is more. Give players the mental space needed to relax and focus by not overcomming. It will keep the environment much more comfortable and positive, and make it much easier to identify the mistakes that you were trying to fix with the comms in the first place.